The Western Front was the place where the belief in the Old Reich was shattered on barbed wire and in drum fire, and where, out of the crater fields, in blood and fire, in hunger and death, the new belief in a better Germany was born. The man who committed some of the most horrendous crimes against humanity and plunged the world into its deadliest war ever is well known to history, and his personal history has probably been studied more than almost any other historical figure. However, a part of Adolf Hitler's life that is often overlooked and portrayed in only one way was his time in the First World War. It's understandable why this hasn't been a highly studied section of Hitler's life, given all his history in the Second World War. But it has also mainly been overlooked because the narrative about this time in his life has been set in stone, mainly due to an incredible amount of Nazi propaganda, Hitler's own exaggerated accounts, and the calculated forming of a myth by the Third Reich. That narrative being that the only thing noteworthy about Hitler's time in World War I is that the horrors of this war, along with the men he served with, radicalized him. In this video, with the help of the brilliantly written book, Hitler's First War, by Thomas Weber, I will attempt to explain the main argument in this book, that World War I did not, in fact, make Hitler. Before we dive into Hitler's time in World War I, it's important to set the proper backdrop of this time in German history. The attitudes and norms of German society between the latter part of the Second Reich through World War I and the Weimar Republic to the beginning of the Third Reich tend to get blurred and lumped together. The political extremism and radical anti-Semitism of the late Weimar years and the Third Reich is so closely associated with German history that many believe Germany was simply always that way. But that's actually incorrect. In the post-Bismarck years and throughout World War I, Germany was actually one of the better countries in Europe to live if you were Jewish. To be clear, that does not mean that there was no anti-Semitism in Germany during this time. There absolutely was. However, Weber makes a well-thought-out distinction in the book that the anti-Semitism that did exist was more along the lines of the traditional Catholic anti-Semitism, rather than what he describes as racial anti-Semitism that would have been present during the Third Reich. This traditional Catholic anti-Semitism more or less consisted of poor opinions about the Jewish religion than about the so-called Jewish race. For the most part, Jews were left alone to live their lives in peace and were an integral part of the economy, especially in Bavaria, which is the region of Germany typically viewed in history as having always been a hotbed of German anti-Semitism. This is important to note because throughout Hitler's time in World War I, he served in the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, or for short, RIR 16. Frequently referred to as the List Regiment, after its first commander, Julius von List. This being a Bavarian regiment, it would have been a great sample of the average Bavarian military-aged male at the time, and we'll be able to see a trend in their political leanings and beliefs. This will become important when discussing whether or not these men, who served side by side with Hitler during World War I, would have had this supposed radicalizing effect on him. This unit was one of 400 infantry regiments and was one of the 6 Bavarian Reserve Divisions, which included 4 reserve infantry regiments, as well as cavalry and artillery units. A total of 59 Jews would serve in the List Regiment throughout World War I, and at the beginning of the war, most Germans celebrated how well Jews were integrated into society, as well as how willing they were to pull their weight in the war. And just as Germany itself at the time was not an inherently anti-Semitic country, neither was the German army. For example, a sample of wartime letters written by 81 different German soldiers sent to a Jewish orphanage in Berlin where most of these soldiers would have grown up, showed that out of 754 letters, only one reported an incident of anti-Semitism. Based on that sample, we can reasonably assume that of course there were occasional incidents of anti-Semitism. However, it was far from a staple of the German military at the time. Other examples that support this view include accounts from soldiers like Bernhard Lustig, who was an NCO in Hitler's regiment. He maintained that RIR 16 in general never displayed any anti-Semitism towards him or other Jews in the regiment, and that the NCOs had gone out of their way to allow the Jews of RIR 16 to practice their Judaism at the front. Other accounts from this time also affirmed that the German military tried to make special arrangements for its Jewish soldiers to celebrate Jewish holidays, whether that meant giving them leave or allowing them to celebrate at the front. One last example to support this came from the Eastern Front, where it had been reported that some German troops even presented themselves to the local Jewish populations as liberators from the anti-Semitism and oppression of Tsarist Russia. An army newspaper in 1916 even went so far as to publish in an article the following, describing the Jews of Eastern Europe as having, quote, truly astonishing vitality and moral fortitude, and a deep and honest thirst for knowledge and education driven by great intelligence, sobriety, temperance, thrift, and a goodness of character, unquote. Given these examples, I believe it is safe to assume that although not completely free of anti-Semitism, the German army as a whole, and the List Regiment, in which Hitler would serve the entirety of the war, was not a place where rabid anti-Semitism flourished. It's most likely that when World War I broke out, Hitler was very enthusiastic and excited to serve. It's debated exactly how enthusiastic he was, and this debate usually is centered around a picture of Germans gathered on the Odeonsplatz the day the war was announced, where you can supposedly see a young Adolf Hitler celebrating. But however enthusiastic he was, it was enough for him to volunteer right away. After being accepted into his regiment and a short training time, Hitler and RIR 16 went off to the front. Hitler's train made its way across the German border into Belgium, then continued on to the destination of Lille, France. Hitler said of the trip, quote, our journey went fairly well and peacefully, but then we had nothing but trouble. In some places, the rails had been prized loose, despite the closest watch, and then we came across an even greater number of blown-up bridges and smashed railway engines. Although our train was moving at a snail's pace, we kept grinding to a halt more and more often. From the distance we could hear the monotonous roar of our heavy mortars. Towards the evening we arrived at a fairly badly damaged suburb of Lille. We got off the train, and then lounged around our piled arms. Shortly before midnight, we at long last marched through the town, along the endless, monotonous road, with low factory buildings on either side, and an endless row of sooty and smoke-blackened tenements, unquote. After spending a couple nights in Lille, RIR 16 began to march their way towards their first action. Their mission was to act as support for the German assault on the British position at Ypres. This battle would later be known as First Ypres. Hitler said the following of his march from Lille to Ypres. Quote, I couldn't sleep. Alas, there was a dead horse 4 paces in front of my palliasse. It looked as if it had been dead for 2 weeks at least. The beast was half decomposed. Just behind us, a German howitzer battery fired 2 shells over our heads into the dark night every 15 minutes. They kept screaming and whistling through the air, followed by 2 dull thuds in the far distance. Every one of us listened out for them. We had never heard anything like it before, and while we lay one pressed against the other, whispering and looking up into the starry sky, the distant noises drew closer and closer. and the individual thuds of the guns came faster and faster, until finally they merged into one continuous roar. Each one of us could feel his blood pound in his veins. We were told the English were making one of their nocturnal attacks. Unsure of what was really going on, we all waited anxiously for the next move. Then everything died down, until finally the hellish din stopped completely, except for our own battery, which kept spitting its iron salutes into the night every 15 minutes. Unquote. Once arriving in Ypres, RIR-16 and Hitler had their baptism of fire. Hitler described the battle in a letter to an acquaintance in the following way. Quote, "We crossed the field at lightning speed, and after many bloody hand-to-hand skirmishes, we cleared the lot of them out of their trenches. Many came out with their hands up. Those who did not surrender were mown down, and so we cleared trench after trench." Unquote. An examination into this particular part of the battle would prove that this account from Hitler, as well as some other claims by him about the amount of casualties, was exaggerated. It is likely that during this battle, Hitler simply tried his best to stay alive and avoid this hand-to-hand combat with the battle-hardened troops that were his opposition at the time. First, Ypres was not kind to the Germans. Nearly 1/4 of men in Hitler's regiment had been killed by November 1914. Hitler's survival of his time in the infantry can in part be attributed to luck of being assigned to the 1st Company in his battalion. If he had, for example, been assigned to the 11th Company, he would have been twice as likely to die during First Ypres. This was the last action of the war that Hitler would see as an infantryman, as his time in the infantry would come to an end on November 9th, 1914, exactly 11 days after RIR-16 arrived at the front. He was assigned to regimental headquarters as a dispatch runner. This position of relative safety compared to the men in the trenches would drastically change how Hitler would view the war compared to many others that served in his regiment. Hitler took to this new role well and adjusted to regimental HQ very easily. He quickly started to view his fellow members of regimental HQ as his family, and he displayed a fierce loyalty to his superiors in this new role. Although he felt at home in his new role in regimental HQ, it should be noted that Hitler was considered by most who knew him during this time as a quiet yet committed outsider. This is visualized in almost every wartime group photograph of him and his comrades, as he's usually seen off to the side. He did join in some group activities with his comrades, but preferred to keep to himself. He spent most of his free time engaged in solitary activities such as reading or painting, and when he and his comrades would leave regimental HQ in the evening to explore the towns in which they were posted nearby, most of them would usually head to the bar and indulge in heavy drinking, or attempt to find a paid female companion for the evening. While this was happening, Hitler would usually roam the streets of the town alone, taking in the scenery, or taking a seat on a bench to paint. In a 1932 report from a former regimental adjutant, it describes a situation at the end of First Ypres, where Hitler may have assisted a fellow dispatch runner in saving their commander's life when he stepped out of the cover of the forest and drew French fire. The report stated that Hitler and his fellow dispatch runner leapt towards the commander, covering him and dragging him back to safety. This report has been disputed, though, as a different report of the same incident claimed that it was Hitler and 3 other dispatch runners who attempted to drag their commander out of danger, and in this report, the commander has not yet come under fire, but is in a potentially dangerous area that could draw fire. 2 days after Hitler's rescue of this commander, he was nearly killed himself when his battle regimental post was shelled. He had only left the post 5 minutes before the shelling. He described the incident as, quote, "the worst moment of my life," unquote. These would be more isolated events for Hitler, however. In his new role as a dispatch runner, he was far less likely to encounter the daily threat of death that the men in the trenches did. He was not a dispatch runner, of a battalion or company, whose job was to deliver messages to the trenches. As a dispatch runner of regimental HQ, Hitler would deliver messages to the HQs of the regiment's battalions. The danger that primarily threatened Hitler would have been artillery fire behind the front. A letter written by a fellow member of regimental HQ describes the feelings about men in him and Hitler's positions from the view of a frontline soldier of RIR 16. Quote, "All soldiers in the trenches thought that those serving with regimental HQ were already Etappenschwein, translated as rear area pigs, and the job as a dispatch runner is thought little of by these men. It cannot be ignored that life was indeed better at regimental HQ than with a company." Unquote. The Battle of the Somme, however, brought danger even to the relatively privileged soldiers behind the front, such as Hitler. It was at the Somme that Hitler was wounded for the first time, when a British shell hit the dispatch runner's dugout and a shell splinter hit Hitler in the upper thigh. As a brief aside and fun fact, this is actually the incident where the rumor of Hitler only having one testicle stems from. The rumor was started by a Polish priest who claimed to have had a conversation in the 1960s with the medic who'd treated Hitler for this injury. The story the medic told to this priest is understood to be completely unsubstantiated by any of Hitler's medical records from the war. The injury, in reality, was a very light wound, which Hitler would greatly embellish in Mein Kampf. He leaves out important information, including that he was moved from the front lines to a dispatch runner by the time of the Somme, implying via omission that he was in fact injured on the front lines at the Somme, rather than 2 kilometers behind the line at regimental HQ. Due to his time recovering from the injury in the hospital, Hitler missed out on the extreme and sudden crash of morale experienced by the men of RIR 16 brought on by the Battle of the Somme. He thus had a very skewed view of what the morale of his regiment was actually like during this time of great loss and misery for the men of RIR 16. By the time Hitler returned to the front, after his stay in hospital, RIR 16 had been moved to a more quiet sector. Because of this, he became oblivious to the sharp fall of morale and increase in disillusion with the war in his regiment. This made him more susceptible to right-wing propaganda after the war about how the socialists, Jews, and women on the home front were responsible for the defeat. Hitler was a huge believer in Kameradschaft, or camaraderie, amongst the German soldiers of World War I, and he would use this throughout his political career. However, what he fails to mention throughout his many uses of this concept in Nazi propaganda is that while he was absent at the Somme, the camaraderie broke down quickly amongst the men of RIR 16, and never recovered to previous levels throughout the second half of the war. Throughout this post-Somme period of the war, things started to turn bad for the Germans. Many in Hitler's unit, and many even in high command, saw the writing on the wall about how bad things would turn out. But Hitler remained steadfast in his blind support of the cause, as well as truly believing that Germany was going to win the war. Any examples of falling morale or negativity that he personally witnessed amongst his regiment, he blamed on the fresh young troops who'd been indoctrinated by the negativity and defeatist opinions of the people on the home front. For Hitler, things seemed as though they weren't going so bad, especially when in August 1918, Hitler was awarded the Iron Cross First Class. This was a focal point of Hitler's World War I service that was exploited by Nazi propaganda to imply that Hitler was an exceptionally brave and decorated soldier. However, it's much more likely, based on the data of which kind of soldier received the Iron Cross First Class, that Hitler received this decoration due to the fact that he was a long and loyal serving member of Regimental HQ than because of his exceptional bravery. The story of how Hitler earned his Iron Cross in Nazi propaganda would be drastically embellished to the point of absurdity. A Nazi newspaper in 1932 described the situation as such. Quote, As a dispatch runner, Hitler had come under a barrage of fire en route to battalion headquarters. He assumed that the battalion lay behind the next hill, rushed up the slope, and ended up in a mine crater occupied by Englishmen, who immediately ordered him to surrender. Hitler pulled out his pistol, which was his only weapon, and with it not only kept the Englishmen at bay, but also managed to take them prisoner and lead them to his regiment's headquarters." Unquote. This story is patently ridiculous and completely untrue. The actual story of how Hitler received his Iron Cross was never brought up by Hitler himself in great detail, because if he were to tell the true version, he would have had to own up to the fact that the prestigious award was given to him by a Jew. More specifically, by Hugo Gutmann, the highest-ranking Jew in RIR 16. The latter part of the war was mostly uneventful for Hitler, until one event near the very end. But during this time period, he was either carrying out his normal duties at regimental HQ, taking leave, or attending training. But out of this lull came most likely the defining moment of the war for Hitler, and was the event that put an end to his service in World War I. This is, of course, when he was on the receiving end of a mustard gas attack. Hitler would also greatly embellish this incident. However, the reality was that the amount of gas he was exposed to was only enough to cause temporarily, albeit very painful symptoms in his eyes, but not enough to leave any permanent damage. The interesting thing about this, however, is that as the story goes, Hitler was temporarily blinded by this mustard gas attack. But it's been determined that the amount of mustard gas he was exposed to was not enough to cause even temporary blindness. Usually, exposure to this amount of mustard gas wouldn't even require an extended stay in hospital, but he did have an extended stay, and this was because Hitler's blindness was diagnosed not as a physical result of the mustard gas, but as psychosomatic. At the military hospital in Pacewalk, where Hitler would remain for the duration of the war, he was treated for war hysteria in the hospital's psychiatric department. A U.S. intelligence report based on an interview with one of the doctors from this department diagnosed Hitler as a psychopath with symptoms of hysteria. And this ends the story of Hitler's time in World War I. From this summary, we can conclude that Hitler's time in the First World War can be summed up as generally much safer than that of the average German soldier due to a combination of different factors, but mainly due to his role in regimental HQ for the vast majority of the war. Because of this, his own view of his time during the war was skewed and seen in a much lighter and less depressing way than the average German veteran of World War I would have viewed their time in the war. When the war ended and Hitler was released from the hospital, he made his way to Munich, as that is where his unit was being demobilized. It's often thought that Hitler made his way to Munich after the war because it was a hotbed of anti-Semitic proto-fascist movements. But Hitler actually didn't care much for Munich. If we can believe his correspondences from his time on leave during the war, he much preferred Berlin to Munich. Unlike many of the men in his unit, Hitler had no close family, friends, or job to come home to. He most likely only went to Munich after the war to be close to the only family he felt he had, his military one. Weber describes Hitler during this time in the following way. Quote, "At the time Hitler returned from the war, he was a man unsure about his future and his identity. He was a man who even now could have been swayed in different directions. His confused ideas about the world could have still been composed in different ways. Hitler and the men from his regiment still had a choice. When Hitler returned to Bavaria in late 1918, his future was still wide open." Unquote. It's important to set the backdrop of what Hitler would have been walking into. Bavaria was in chaos when the war ended. A socialist revolution was taking place, and people were fractioned into different radical political groups. and a flood of returning soldiers from the front were arriving home every day. What is interesting, though, is that in Hitler's unit, as well as the German military as a whole, most soldiers returning home just wanted peace and to be able to return to their normal lives and their families. Not many were ready to take up arms again, either for a right-wing or left-wing radical group fighting for control of Bavaria at the time. It's also worth noting that in the Soldiers' Council elections of RIR 16 that took place after the war, the vast majority voted for candidates who were not radical socialists. They also mostly shunned the radical right-wing Freikorps, which took up arms against radical Bolsheviks in the East. This suggests the lack of political radicalization amongst Hitler's unit, putting a dent in the common assumption that the men of his unit had a politically radicalizing effect on Hitler. Not a huge amount of information is known about Hitler's first 5 months after the war, as he would always skim over this period of his life while speaking, and he went out of his way to keep the information about this time suppressed. In the spring of 1919, as a soldier based in Munich, Hitler was to serve the government of the short-lived Bavarian Socialist Republic that emerged from the chaos of the revolution after the end of the war. He would later rail against this government in Mein Kampf. During this time, Kurt Eisner, the head of the Bavarian Socialist Republic, was assassinated by a radical right-wing former officer. There is surviving footage of his funeral, where you can see Hitler with a few men from his unit in the procession. In this footage, Hitler is wearing 2 armbands, a black one to mourn the death of Eisner, and a red one to represent the socialist revolution. Many point to this footage as damning proof that Hitler was indeed a fervent socialist, mainly to make a lazy political point. But it's much more likely that he was, as Weber suggests, unsure exactly what he was at this moment, and was just performing his duties while still a member of the army. It's important to note, however, that Hitler during this period could have been demobilized from the army if he so desired, but he didn't. This begs an important question. If his ideology was already set and solidified during the war, then why didn't Hitler break away from the army during the Socialist Republic period and join a right-wing resistance group? After the collapse of the Bavarian Socialist Republic, Hitler eventually began working for the counter-revolutionary unit in the army, where his job was essentially to give speeches to military men about the dangers and evils of Bolshevism, and to observe many of the small political groups popping up all over Munich. One of those groups which Hitler was ordered to observe, on September 12, 1919, was the German Workers' Party, the precursor to the Nazi Party. Hitler disliked his job in the propaganda unit, but he immediately took to this new party that he was ordered to observe. So much so that he joined within a week of the first meeting that he attended. And with the majority of the men from his unit decommissioned, and his current position in the army unfulfilling and lonely, he took to this party in full force, almost as a replacement family for the military family he'd lost when the war ended. On March 31, 1920, 6 months after discovering the German Workers' Party, Hitler was decommissioned from the army. Now with his full attention turned to the newly renamed National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazis for short, Hitler became a rising star. During his rise in the party, he immediately had the idea of trying to merge his old military family with his new party family. He desperately attempted to recruit men from his unit to the party, but this did not go as planned for him. Although he did get a couple of his closest wartime friends to join, the vast majority of officers from RIR 16 would never join the Nazi Party. Hitler even tried recruiting for the party at a 1922 reunion of RIR 16 veterans, but garnered little attention or enthusiasm from his old brothers in arms. To add insult to injury, the man who gave the main address and captivated all the attention at the reunion was Wilhelm Dice, an educated lawyer, non-racist wartime officer, married to a half-Jew, and a Bavarian German patriot. He was the anti-Hitler in almost every way. During the Second World War, he would even join a Hitler resistance group. Hitler was so unsatisfied with his rejection and the admiration of Dice that he would never again attend a meeting of veterans of RIR 16. Overall, the majority of German men who fought in World War I did not end up joining the Nazi Party. It was actually far more common that the generation that had been too young to fight in the First World War were far more likely to join the Nazi Party. Hitler continued to rise in the party throughout the early 1920s, and became so overconfident in his party's popularity and capabilities that in 1923 he helped lead the infamous Beer Hall Putsch, which was an attempt by the party to overthrow the Bavarian government. After this failed spectacularly, Hitler was locked away in Landsberg Fortress, where he began writing Mein Kampf. In it, he began to solidify the myth that the war made him and led him to National Socialism. Weber wrote of Hitler at this time the following, quote, "He claimed that his 4 years on the Western Front had provided him with prophet-like revelations that would allow him to lead Germany away from the trauma of defeat." Unquote. After his release from Landsberg, Hitler began to heavily focus on the concept of Kameradschaft when referring to his origins in World War I, and how he wished to project it onto the ideal Nazi society. Invoking Kameradschaft in his World War I service in general became a central focal point of Nazi propaganda. From the period of 1925 to 1933, the propaganda creating the myth of RIR 16 making Hitler became prominent. This made it very dangerous for anyone who dared to question Hitler's wartime service, or for anyone involved in a major focal point of Hitler's service, such as a man like Hugo Gutmann, the man who awarded him his Iron Cross First Class. The honor code of the German military played to Hitler's advantage in this respect. Historically, questioning the honor of a German soldier's service prior to World War I would often result in a duel, or being brought before the honor courts. This tradition of the honor code thus continued to have heavy implications during and after World War I, even with the doing away of duels. However, few did break this code. Those who dared speak out against Hitler's World War I narrative were put down immediately. If you were going to publicly speak out against Hitler's wartime service in any way that went against the narrative, you could expect a swift visit from the Gestapo. Even without speaking out and laying low, this is what happened to Hugo Gutmann. Being the Jew that awarded Hitler his highest military honor made him a dangerous liability to Hitler, and a prime target for Nazi thugs. In July 1937, the Gestapo arrested Hugo Gutmann under the pretense that he had made, quote, contemptuous, derogatory, and untrue comments about the Fuhrer, unquote. However, for unknown reasons, he was released in September of that same year. Little more than a year later, in 1938, Gutmann narrowly escaped Kristallnacht when he was tipped off minutes before Nazis arrived at his apartment. He and his family would flee Germany for the United States shortly after. From the mid-1930s on, we pretty much know the story. Hitler and the Nazis gained more popularity in the mainstream, and utilized the German conservatives to scheme their way into power. The rest is history, a very dark history, but we still haven't officially answered the question of this video. Did World War I and the men of RIR 16 make Hitler? I believe the answer to this thesis is unequivocally no. Throughout the entirety of Hitler's First War, there's a very real consistency of evidence that this narrative had been carefully constructed by Hitler and the Nazi Party, and jingoistically enforced by the iron fist of the Third Reich. But once Hitler was gone and the Third Reich toppled, this myth stuck, and it's easy to see why. The First World War informed so many decisions of so many of the major figures in World War II that it almost seems natural and par for the course to blame a major figure's experience in World War I for what they did in World War II. Philippe Pétain decides to surrender right away during the Nazi invasion in a desperate attempt to avoid another Verdun. Charles de Gaulle refuses to surrender and becomes the leader of Free France, just as he refused to accept his fate in a POW camp during World War I, trying to escape the camp for the entirety of the war. And Adolf Hitler was so hardened and filled with hate from his time on the hellish Western Front during World War I that he decides to take out his anger on the world and an entire race of people 20 years later. Fits pretty well, doesn't it? So this narrative was just accepted and has been ever since. I believe Hitler's First War is a very important book, and its thesis is important in more ways than one. We don't want to keep accepting the Nazi propaganda that this historical narrative is born out of, and we also don't want to group the majority of men from RIR 16 in with Hitler and fall victim to the belief that them and Hitler sat around the Western Front between attacks talking about how much the Jews were to blame for everything going wrong, because that's not how it was. And I personally believe that the unit should be remembered far more for its members like Hugo Gutmann and the men who faithfully served under him, regardless of the fact that he was a Jew. Thank you so much for watching. This video has been a long time coming and was definitely a huge passion project of mine, and I hope I did the topic justice. If you like this video, please leave a like and consider subscribing. This has been Kaiser Caliber History.